17-year-old Margaret fled into the Tennessee wilderness after her father's final brutal beating left her barely conscious. Collapsing from exhaustion near a frozen creek, she expected death to claim her. Instead, she woke up in a trapper's cabin, saved by a widowed mountain man who saw something in her shattered soul. What he didn't tell her was that he'd been waiting decades for her arrival. Hello, my dear friend. This is Jasper Ashwood, your narrator of Mountain Tales. Before we start, make sure you subscribe and drop a comment below telling me where you're tuning in from. A big hug to you all, and I hope you enjoy the story. In the brutal and merciless lands that stretch toward the horizon around the small trading post of Boone Station, Tennessee, the life of 17-year-old Margaret Hayes was not measured in seasons, but in the quiet moments between her father's violent outbursts. She was beaten for the weakness of the fire, for burning the cornbread, for the unforgivable crime of simply existing. Her father, Josiah Hayes, was a man destroyed by the very frontier that had promised him wealth. Each evening he returned from his worthless trap lines, his pack empty of beaver pelts, but overflowing with a festering anger that needed release, and it always found the delicate body of his only child. Their cabin, a desolate structure of hand-hewn timber and wind-scarred misery, was not a shelter. It was a tomb, a place where the scream of wolves through the hollows was an odd comfort, for it frequently covered the sound of her own sobbing. Margaret had mastered the skill of disappearing, to drift through the confined area like morning mist, her soul a lone, persistent flame, flickering weakly against an endless storm of brutality. She did not fantasize about a noble knight or a life of luxury. In the blackest hours before sunrise, wrapped beneath a threadbare blanket, she fantasized only of the complete and peaceful nothingness of death. She navigated her existence with a silent, careful precision born of sheer survival instinct. She knew the specific whine of the board that would expose her location, the precise instant to remove her father's tin plate, before his disappointment could transform into rage. Her universe was a chart of dangers and refuges, an unending assessment of endurance. She discovered an unexpected peace in the patterns of the wilderness itself. She learned to interpret the fog banks, to sense when a blizzard was forming in the distant peaks, its violence a reflection to the tempest that dwelled within her own dwelling. She observed the eagles soar on the updrafts, their liberty a piercing agony in her heart. They were everything she was not, unbound, mighty rulers of their own heavens. Her hands, though hardened from fetching firewood and scouring pots, contained a hidden gentleness. She would discover small, stubborn wildflowers forcing their way through the frozen ground and wonder at their determination, recognizing in them a mirror of the fragment of herself she struggled to preserve. This was her inner sanctuary, a realm of silent watching and intense, wordless yearning, a fortress no man's violence could ever penetrate. Deep within a loose stone beneath the hearth, concealed under a scrap of deerskin, was her only genuine treasure, a polished chestnut-brown acorn, smoothed to a flawless sphere by hands she could barely recall. It was the final remnant of her mother, a woman whose features had faded to a foggy phantom, but whose tender caress she could still sense in the cool, weighty comfort of the acorn. It was a charm against the advancing despair, a voiceless vow that another existence, a gentler existence, had once been real. But even the most refined survival has its breaking point. The destruction of her world arrived on a twilight when the eastern sky bled in savage shades of bruised gray and burning crimson, as if the clouds themselves were injured. Josiah returned not with the customary simmering fury, but with a horrifying, empty coldness in his gaze. He had been denied credit at the trading post. His final chance of survival turned to ashes. The raw whiskey on his breath was harsher, the hopelessness surrounding him like a funeral shroud. He uttered nothing as he entered, his quietness more threatening than any roar. Margaret felt the atmosphere in the cabin grow dense and suffocating, loaded with an unspoken finality. He did not bellow, he did not swear. He simply turned, his face a vision of devastation. And in that instant, Margaret understood that the man was vanished, replaced by something completely shattered and intent on destroying the last thing he held any control over. This time, as his fist clenched, she knew it was unlike before. It was not discipline, it was extinction. A primal, long-buried instinct blazed within her, a force that demanded not for surrender, but for survival. As his shadow consumed her, she grasped with icy certainty that to stay in that cabin for another heartbeat was to welcome her own burial. The universe shattered into one explosive instant, the animal hunger to live. Margaret threw herself from her wooden stool, a strangled scream ripping from her throat as she lunged for the entrance. The plank splintered against her shoulder as she hurled her weight forward, erupting out into the glacial night atmosphere. The shock of the freeze was a strike to her senses, a violent awakening that momentarily erased the panic from her consciousness. She did not glance backward. To glance backward was to risk glimpsing the demon in the doorway, the silhouette of the man who had been her father. And she understood with a conviction that rattled her to her very core that if she glimpsed him, her limbs would collapse. So she ran. She ran from the dancing, sinister orange glow of the cabin bleeding out into the blackness, a corruption on the pure clarity of the darkness. She ran from the echo of her own name being howled into the tempest, a sound that had once signified authority, but now was nothing more than the frantic bellow of a tyrant losing his only prisoner. The terrain was a treacherous wasteland of jagged stones and hidden ravines, but she registered none of it. Her feet, toughened by a life of deprivation, barely noticed the slashes and stabs of the ruthless earth. Her reality had contracted to the fire in her chest, the wild, terrified pounding of her own pulse against her ribs, and the singular, frantic necessity to create as much separation as possible between her history and her tomorrow. The landscape of Boone Station, which had always appeared a monotonous jail of brown and white, transformed under the moonlight into a place of deep and terrifying majesty. Massive rock cliffs became silent, observing titans. The twisted oaks whispered mysteries on the breeze, their scent sharp and pure in her gasping chest. For the first time, she was genuinely alone in this untamed land, not merely observing it from the limits of the cabin, but a component of it as wild and untamed as any beast that inhabited these mountains. A peculiar lucidity began to slice through her dread. Every ragged gasp she pulled was her own. Every screaming muscle was a monument to her own determination to endure. The agony was transformed now. It was not the passive, degrading agony of a thrashing, but the active, blazing agony of effort, of escape, of existence itself, refusing to be snuffed out. Blood from a gash on her cheekbone, where a hurled bottle had struck her earlier, dripped down her jaw, but it seemed less like an injury and more like battle markings. She was no longer a phantom in a dusty cabin. She was a living, gasping creature, racing for her existence. And in that frantic race she experienced a spark of a strength she never knew she contained. A fragment of her consciousness, the fragment that had learned to tolerate, screamed at her to halt, to return, to surrender to her fate. But a fresher, more powerful voice, born in that ultimate moment of rebellion, pushed her forward, offering nothing but the mysterious. A promise that was suddenly more alluring than the guarantee of destruction. Deeper into the wooded ridges, where the familiar markers of her oppressive universe had disappeared, she finally permitted herself to stumble to a stop. Concealed behind a curtain of ancient hemlocks, she leaned against the frozen bark, her body shaking uncontrollably, her breath emerging in ragged, agonizing gasps. It was in that moment of stillness, as her fingers clawed for grip on the tree trunk, that she felt it. It was not the rough, natural grain of the bark. It was a sequence of smooth, intentional notches carved into the wood and weathered by innumerable winters. Her fingers followed them in the shadows, sensing the unmistakable pattern of a human tool. Below the notches, bound to the exposed root of a sturdy hemlock with a strip of dried sinew, was a small bundle of eagle feathers. It was a marker, a signal. It was proof of a universe that existed entirely beyond Josiah Hayes, beyond the trading posts and the whiskey-drenched desperation. This forest was not vacant. It held a secret tongue, a chronicle written in wood and feather that she had been completely unaware of. The discovery did not terrify her. Instead, it transmitted a strange surge of tranquility through her. It was a profound and humbling awareness that her suffering, which had seemed as infinite as the horizon, was but a tiny, insignificant tale in a land that contained countless others. She was not the first person to seek sanctuary in these ridges. She was not the first soul to escape in the shadows. This small, silent discovery was the final cord that bound her to her former life. The weariness held at bay by adrenaline and terror now fell upon her like a physical mass, a crushing weight of cold and exhaustion. The power that had driven her out of the cabin and up into the ridges simply evaporated, leaving her limbs feeling like iron. Her vision began to dim, the specks of starlight swimming and twisting into blurred streams of light. The universe tilted on its foundation, the ground appearing to surge up to embrace her. Her legs, which had transported her so far, finally gave way. She tumbled to the soil, the collision barely registering through the haze of her failing consciousness. The last thing she witnessed was the vast, indifferent sweep of the constellations across the obsidian sky. The last thing she sensed was the cold, firm embrace of the Tennessee earth. And as the blackness flooded her senses, a final coherent thought emerged. She did not think of her father, nor of the suffering. She thought of the eagle feathers, a symbol of the wild freedom she had so desperately desired. And with that, she surrendered, her body finally yielding, her spirit floating into a profound quiet, suspended in the vast, waiting wilderness between one existence and the next. Consciousness returned not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, emerging sunrise. The first sense to revive was smell. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of hickory smoke, cured meat, and a clean, leathery aroma she couldn't identify. It was a universe away from the stale, bitter odor of whiskey and unwashed wool that had characterized her life. Next came touch. She was lying on something soft, a bed of pine boughs covered with the thick, warm hide of a black bear. A gentle, steady warmth radiated from a small contained hearth nearby, a stark contrast to the irregular, angry heat of her father's fireplace. Then sound, not the violent howl of the wind across an open ridge, but the gentle, rhythmic whisper of a nearby spring. A sound so peaceful it felt like a lullaby. For a long moment she kept her eyes sealed, convinced she was in a vision, perhaps the antechamber to the eternal silence she had once desired. She was afraid that opening them would destroy the illusion and return her to the cold, hard reality of the cabin. When she finally found the courage to open her eyes, she saw him. He was sitting by the fire, his back to her, stitching a piece of buckskin with an bone awl. He was an old man, his frame lean but powerful, his long silver hair tied back with a simple leather thong. When he eventually turned, she saw a face that seemed carved from the very mountains around them, a landscape of deep creases and weathered patience. His eyes were pale blue and penetrating, but they held no cruelty. They held a profound and ancient calmness, the look of a man who had witnessed the passage of countless winters and was startled by very little. Her body reacted before her mind could, a surge of pure, conditioned panic seizing her. She tried to scramble backwards to flee, but a cry of pain escaped her as her battered muscles objected. The movement was a pathetic shuffle, and the man simply watched her, his expression unchanging. He made no move to restrain her, no move to approach her. This simple inaction was more disarming than any statement he could have spoken. He allowed her the dignity of her fear, and in doing so, began the slow process of dismantling it. The days that followed unfolded in this same quiet rhythm. Her rescuer, whose name she did not know, tended to her with a silent, methodical grace. He would leave a wooden bowl of warm, hearty stew and a cup of cool water near her sleeping place, then retreat to his own tasks, never watching to see if she ate. He cleaned her wounds and applied poultices of crushed roots and pungent salves that cooled the fire in her skin and eased the deep ache in her bones. His hands were rough and calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle, impersonal, like a craftsman tending to a delicate instrument. Margaret, who had only ever known care as a prelude to obligation or touch as a precursor to pain, was utterly bewildered. This man asked for nothing. He demanded no gratitude, no explanation, no conversation. He simply provided what was necessary for life to continue. This profound and unconditional quiet was the most powerful medicine he could have offered. It gave the wounds inside her, the ones no salve could reach, the space they needed to begin to heal. She started to watch him, her fear slowly giving way to a deep, weary curiosity. She watched him track the sun's progress across the mountain ridge, watched the effortless way he moved through the wilderness. A man entirely at home in a world that had always terrified her. As her strength returned, and the fog of pain began to recede, her eyes started to take in the details of her sanctuary. It was a small hidden camp, tucked into a sheltered cove in a secret hollow, almost invisible from the ridge. Everything had its place, a life distilled to its essentials, tools carved from bone and antler, baskets woven from willow strips, a small iron pot for cooking. And then she saw it folded neatly in a corner was a wool blanket. Its colors faded by time and sunlight, but the pattern was unmistakable. A series of interlocking stars, woven in a deep forest green and a warm golden yellow. The sight was like a key turning in a long locked chamber in her memory. A fragment of an image surfaced, hazy, and dreamlike. Her mother, her face young and unlined by sorrow, wrapping that very same pattern around Margaret's small shoulders, humming a melody without words. The memory was so vivid, so painful, it stole her breath. This place, this man, was somehow connected not just to her survival, but to the only source of pure love she had ever known. The threads of fate felt suddenly visible, and she understood that her desperate flight into the wilderness had not been a random act of survival, but the first step on a path that had been waiting for her all along. One evening, as the last light of the sun painted the mountain walls in strokes of fire, the old man approached her. It was the first time he had come to her with a purpose other than delivering food or medicine. He looked at her, his pale eyes seeming to see not just the girl huddled in the furs, but the flickering spirit within. He saw the question that had taken root there, the question of whether to continue. He knelt and placed 2 items on the flat stone before her. The first was a familiar wooden bowl steaming with a fragrant, nourishing stew, the aroma a promise of strength and continued life. The second was a small leather pouch tied with a sinew string. He opened it slightly, revealing a collection of dried, pale roots and seeds. He did not need to explain their purpose. Margaret, who had seen the plants of the high country her whole life, knew that in that pouch lay a sleep from which there was no waking. The old man said nothing, but his silence was a language all its own. He had mended her body, but the choice to live, to truly inhabit it once more, was a choice only she could make. He would not force her to stay. He would not tether a spirit that wished to be free. The choice was now hers. The bowl or the pouch, life or the oblivion she had once so desperately craved. Her gaze lingered on the small leather pouch. It represented an end to memory, an end to the scars that lined her back and the fear that had been etched onto her soul. It was the easy peace, the silent forgetting she had prayed for in the dark of her father's cabin. But when she looked at the steaming bowl, she did not just see stew. She saw the patient hands that had gathered the ingredients, the quiet fire that had warmed it, the profound unspoken belief that her life was a thing worth saving. She saw the flash of her mother's blanket, a single vibrant thread of love stretching across a wasteland of years. To choose the pouch would be to sever that thread forever. To choose the pouch would be to let Josiah Hayes have the final victory. A slow, determined fire ignited in her chest, a feeling so foreign she barely recognized it as her own will. With a hand that trembled only slightly, she reached past the pouch of final sleep and took the bowl. Lifting it to her lips, she drank. It was more than sustenance, it was an oath. Each sip was a declaration that she would not be erased. She was choosing to live. From that day forward, everything changed. Her healing was no longer a passive state of receiving care, but an active process of learning to inhabit the world. Ezekiel, sensing the shift in her, became her silent tutor. The wilderness, once a terrifying void, was transformed into a living classroom. He never lectured, he simply did and expected her to watch, to learn and to replicate. He showed her how to find water, not by looking for the stream, but by watching the flight paths of ravens at dusk. He taught her to distinguish the silver leaves of the yarrow plant, whose paste could close a wound, from the nearly identical leaves of a plant that brought only sickness. She learned to move, not like a frightened girl crashing through the undergrowth, but with the quiet, deliberate steps of a hunter, placing her feet so as not to snap a single branch. Her hands, once raw from lye, soap and scrubbing, now grew calloused from different work, grinding hickory nuts into meal, scraping hides to make leather, and learning the patient rhythmic art of sparking a flame with flint and steel. There were no words of praise, no encouraging smiles. His approval was a far subtler thing, a quiet nod when she identified the right plant, or the simple act of leaving a more complex task for her to complete in his absence. These small unspoken gestures of trust were more valuable to Margaret than any applause. They were the building blocks of a new self, a person defined not by her suffering, but by her growing competence. The first true test of this new self came as the seasons began to turn. The small spring that trickled through their hollow, the lifeblood of their hidden sanctuary, began to change. The water level dropped, and a faint metallic bitterness tainted its taste. The small water-loving birds that normally chattered along its banks grew silent and disappeared. Ezekiel grew troubled, his calm demeanor replaced by a deep, furrowed concern. His experience told him the source must be a blockage high up in the hollow, a dangerous and difficult climb for his aging bones. As he gathered ropes and prepared for the ascent, Margaret felt a familiar prickle of anxiety. the hyper-vigilance that had been her constant companion in her father's cabin. She walked the banks of the dying spring, her eyes scanning not for the obvious, but for the subtle signs of wrongness. It was a skill honed by years of trying to predict her father's moods from the slightest shift in his posture or the tone of his voice. She noticed what Ezekiel, in his focus on the larger problem, had missed: a thin, whitish film clinging to the downstream side of the rocks, and the way the roots of the willows near the water's edge were turning a sickly brown. She remembered seeing a small landslide in a side ravine weeks before, an event she had paid little mind. Now her intuition screamed that the two events were connected. Gathering her courage, she approached Ezekiel, touching his arm to stop his preparations. Using a stick to draw in the dirt, she sketched the hollow, the spring, and the location of the slide. She pointed to her drawing, then to her tongue, mimicking a bitter taste. He watched her, his expression unreadable, then followed as she led him away from the main hollow and into the narrow ravine. The air there was different, heavy with the smell of iron, and there was the source. The landslide had not blocked the spring, but had sheared away the side of the hill, exposing a raw vein of rusty red ore. Rainwater seeping down from the heights was trickling over this exposed mineral deposit, carrying its poison down into the groundwater that fed their spring. Ezekiel stood in silence for a long time, looking from the poisoned rock to the young woman beside him. He had been looking for a problem of brute force, a dam of fallen trees, a wall of mud. She had seen the truth in a whisper of evidence, a subtle language of decay. In that moment, the dynamic between them shifted forever. He was no longer just the savior, and she was no longer just the survivor. They were partners. He placed a hand on her shoulder, a brief, firm gesture of profound and unequivocal respect. They spent the next 3 days working together, using fallen logs and packed clay to build a diversion channel, redirecting the clean water from higher up before it could reach the toxic minerals. It was grueling work, but it was shared work, a rhythm of effort and purpose that left Margaret feeling more whole than she had ever been. As they returned to their camp on the third evening, weary but triumphant, a deep sense of peace settled over her. This place was no longer just a temporary refuge, it was a home she had helped to save. But as they stepped into the clearing, the peaceful silence was violently broken. The air was wrong. Her eyes, now trained to notice every detail, immediately saw the violations. In the soft earth near the fire pit, there were 2 sets of deep, sharp prints left by shod horses, and lying on its side, half buried in the dirt, was a dark brown bottle, its label bearing the familiar name of a cheap brand of whiskey. A cold dread, sharp and sickeningly familiar, washed over Margaret, erasing the warmth of their victory. The sanctuary was no longer secret. The world of violent, careless men, the world she had nearly died to escape, had found her. The silence that followed the discovery was heavier than any sound. The discarded bottle was a venomous snake in their sanctuary, a sign that the poison of the world she had fled was not contained, but seeped through the land itself. Margaret felt a familiar coldness creep into her veins, the icy paralysis of a cornered animal. Ezekiel's face was grim, his eyes fixed on the shod hoof prints as if they were a declaration of war. They did not have to wait long for the battle to arrive. 2 men rode into the hollow clearing, their movements clumsy and loud, their voices echoing off the sacred walls like a profanity. They were land speculators, their faces burned by the sun and coarsened by greed, their clothes stained with dirt and cheap whiskey. They moved with the careless arrogance of men who believed the world and everything in it was theirs for the taking. Their laughter, a harsh, grating sound that shattered the hollow's tranquility. When they saw Ezekiel, they reined in their horses, their expressions shifting to a mixture of contempt and suspicion. They saw not a man who was part of the land, but an obstacle upon it. They dismounted, their spurs jingling, and approached the old man with a swaggering intimidation that was sickeningly familiar to Margaret. Watching from a crevice in the rocks, she felt her breath catch in her throat. It was happening again. The same senseless malevolence, the same use of size and threat to dominate and control. The taller of the 2 men shoved Ezekiel's shoulder. It was a casual act of disrespect meant to test his compliance. Ezekiel stumbled, but did not fall, his dignity a silent, unreachable wall against their aggression. The men began to taunt him, their words a stream of slurs and demands, asking if he'd found any good land, if he knew of any timber stands. Convinced he was hiding some valuable claim from them, Margaret was frozen. Trapped in the memory of countless similar moments in the cabin, her body braced for the inevitable explosion of violence. It was then that the second man, eager to boast, revealed the terrible truth. He laughed, a wheezing, unpleasant sound, and slapped his thigh. He spoke of their incredible luck, how they had found this hidden paradise by following a faded, hand-drawn survey map. A map they had bought for a pittance in Boone's Station from the belongings of a pathetic old trapper who had died alone, having chased a fool's dream in these very hills. The man described him with mocking pity, a stubborn drunk who swore this land owed him a fortune, a man who had left nothing behind but a dilapidated cabin and a reputation for madness and cruelty. With a final, chilling detail, he mentioned the trapper's name, Josiah Hayes. The name struck Margaret with the force of a physical blow. The world tilted, the rocks around her seeming to close in. It was not chance that had brought these men here. It was the ghost of her own father. His obsessive, destructive greed had outlived him, reaching out from the grave to lead this new evil directly to her door. The past was not something she could simply outrun. It was a trail she left behind, one that others could follow. That realization shattered her paralysis. The ice in her veins did not melt, but hardened into a cold, sharp resolve. This was not her father's prison. This was her home, a place she had helped to save, a place where she had chosen life. She would not allow her father's legacy to destroy this too. A desperate, dangerous plan began to form in her mind, a plan woven from the threads of both her lives. She knew she could not fight these men with force, but her father had taught her about the weaknesses of cruel men, and Ezekiel had taught her about the secrets of the earth. She slipped away from her hiding place, moving with a silence Ezekiel himself had taught her. Her destination was a small shaded patch of earth where a cluster of innocent-looking white berries grew. Ezekiel had pointed them out to her once, warning her that their pulp, while not lethal, held the spirit of Devil's Claw, a fast-acting poison that would bring a strong man to his knees with agonizing cramps and confusion. She gathered a handful of the pale berries, her movements quick and precise. Returning to the camp's edge, she prepared a simple stew with dried venison and the last of their ground hickory meal. Into the pot, she crushed the soft berries. Then she did the hardest part. She transformed herself. She let her shoulders slump, wiped dirt on her cheeks, and adopted the wide-eyed, vacant stare of a frightened, simple-minded girl. She approached the speculator's camp, holding out the pot of stew, mumbling that it was a gift, a peace offering. The men who had been growing bored of tormenting Ezekiel turned their attention to her. They saw exactly what she wanted them to see, a half-wit girl, easily intimidated and of no consequence. They laughed at her, snatching the pot from her hands. They saw her offer not as a strategy, but as the terrified submission they believed was their right. They ate quickly and greedily, their guard completely down. The effect was astonishingly fast. The boasting and laughter died, replaced by choked groans. Their faces turned a sickly shade of green as the poison took hold, gripping their insides with a vicious, invisible fist. Their arrogance dissolved into panicked, wretched sickness. Within minutes, they were stumbling blindly for their horses, convinced the hollow itself was cursed, and fled without a backward glance. The silence that returned to the hollow was absolute. The threat was gone, vanquished not by a weapon of steel, but by a simple berry and a deep understanding of human cruelty. Margaret stood trembling, the now empty pot still in her hands. She turned to Ezekiel, a storm of emotions churning inside her. She had protected him. She had defended their home. She expected to see relief in his eyes, perhaps even pride. But his expression was one she had never seen before. It was a look of profound, heart-wrenching sorrow, mixed with something that looked almost like fear. He saw not the frightened girl she had pretended to be, but the calculating survivor she had been forced to become. He had seen the chilling precision of her actions, the cold fire in her eyes. He walked toward her, and in a voice that was barely more than a whisper, he spoke. He did not thank her. He did not ask if she was unharmed. He looked deep into her soul and asked a question that laid her entire past bare. "What brutal world," he said, his voice heavy with a terrible empathy, "could teach a child to serve a meal with such a quiet and perfect hatred?" Ezekiel's question did not demand an immediate answer. It hung in the quiet air of the hollow, not as an accusation, but as an invitation. He had seen the weapon she carried within her, and he was not asking her to justify it, but to lay it down. For the first time in her life, Margaret felt the solid ground of safety beneath her feet, a foundation of trust strong enough to bear the weight of her past. The words, when they finally came, were not a steady stream, but broken fragments like pieces of a shattered pot she was trying to reassemble. She spoke of a silence that was filled with fear, of a man whose love had been twisted into a fist, of the endless suffocating dust of the cabin. And then, her voice softening, she spoke of her mother, a woman she barely remembered, and the single vivid memory sparked by the woven blanket, a memory that had become her only shield against the darkness. She spoke until the words ran out, leaving her hollowed out and trembling, not from cold, but from the raw, painful release of a lifetime of unshed tears. Ezekiel listened with a stillness that absorbed every word, his face a mask of profound empathy. He did not offer empty comforts or platitudes. When she fell silent, he simply nodded as if she had confirmed something he had long suspected. He rose slowly and went inside his small rock-sheltered dwelling. He returned a moment later, his hands cupped around a small object. He knelt before her again and opened his palms. Lying there was a small wooden bird, its paint faded to the palest shade of blue, its form worn smooth by the passage of years. He began to speak, his voice soft, telling a story from a time long ago. He spoke of his wife, Sarah Grace, and of a young woman who would sometimes visit their camp, a woman with hair the color of corn silk and eyes that held the kindness of the summer sky. He said this woman was different from the others. She did not look at mountain folk with fear or contempt, but with curiosity and respect. She and his wife would trade things of value. Sarah Grace would give her wild herbs for healing, and the woman would bring them needles and cloth. He said the woman had a gentle spirit but a deep, quiet strength, and one day she had come to them with her newborn daughter. He had carved this small bluebird. He explained as a gift for the child. As he spoke, Margaret's world began to reform around a new and astonishing center. He was talking about her mother, the gentle hands, the forgotten lullabies, the blanket. It was all real. He had known her. His wife had been her mother's friend. This revelation was a seismic shift in the landscape of her soul. Her rescue had not been an act of random kindness from a stranger. It was the closing of a sacred circle, a debt of friendship being repaid across a generation. She was not an outsider who had stumbled into this sanctuary. She was, in a way she could never have imagined, coming home. The bond between them, already forged in crisis and quiet understanding, was now sealed by the grace of their shared history. The days and weeks that followed were a time of deep and restorative peace. The fear that had been Margaret's constant shadow finally receded, chased away by the warmth of this newfound kinship. They worked together in a new, effortless harmony. She learned the mountain man names for the stars, which he pointed out with a gnarled finger, and she in turn told him the stories her schoolteacher had once told her about the same constellations. They were two different languages for the same sky, and they found a quiet joy in the sharing. Her laughter, once a sound she had thought lost to her forever, began to return. At first, a quiet, rusty thing, but soon a genuine expression of a spirit slowly remembering how to be light. Ezekiel, for his part, found in her a balm for the long years of his solitude. She was the daughter he never had, a living echo of the kindness his wife had once found in a friend from another world. Their life fell into a gentle, healing rhythm, dictated by the sun and the seasons. The hollow, once a place of refuge, was now a true home, its walls holding not just safety, but the promise of a future. Margaret began to believe that she might live out her days in this hidden peace, that the violent, grasping world of men like her father could never touch them. Here she had found her place, a small pocket of existence, where her scars were not a source of shame, but a testament to the strength that had brought her to this point of grace. She felt a sense of belonging so profound it was almost painful, a fragile, beautiful thing she guarded with every fiber of her being. But the world of measured lines and sharp commerce has little respect for circles. The peace was broken on a crisp autumn afternoon, not by the sound of drunken shouts, but by the clean, decisive crunch of heavy boots on gravel. A man appeared at the entrance to their hollow. He was alone, but he represented a force more powerful than any band of speculators. He wore a crisp, clean uniform, and he carried a surveyor's instrument over his shoulder. He was polite, his voice devoid of any emotion. As he addressed Ezekiel, he unrolled a document, a stark white page covered in a grid of black lines that carved the mountains and streams into neat, soulless squares. He informed them with the cold, unassailable authority of a government decree that this land had been officially surveyed, charted, and sectioned for settlement. Their hollow, their home, their sacred space was now designated as Parcel 89, and according to the document he held, they were trespassing. The surveyor's final words hung in the air long after he was gone. an invisible fence caging them in. The map he had displayed was more than paper and ink. It was a weapon, one that could dismantle their world without firing a single shot. In the face of this new, sterile kind of violence, Ezekiel's posture seemed to shrink. He did not show anger or fear, but something far more heartbreaking, a profound, bone-deep weariness. It was the resignation of a man who was witnessing the final chapter of a story he had seen unfold his entire life. The story of frontier folk being systematically displaced, not always with bullets, but with lines on a page and laws written in a language that had no words for what was being lost. For him, this was not a new battle, but the final echo of a war that had been lost long ago. He looked at the ancient hollow walls, not as a homeowner looking at his property, but as a man preparing to say goodbye to his oldest and dearest friend. But Margaret was not weary. She was incandescent with a rage so pure and protective, it felt like a physical force inside her. She had not survived her father's fists, only to be defeated by a piece of paper. She had not chosen life in this hollow, only to have it stolen by a distant government and a grid of numbered parcels. The timid girl who had fled into the night was gone, and in her place stood a woman who had learned to fight, not with brute strength, but with the fierce, unyielding tenacity of a wildflower growing through rock. This sanctuary had given her more than just shelter. It had given her a soul, and she would not let it be taken without a fight. She refused to accept Ezekiel's quiet surrender. She saw it not as weakness, but as the result of a lifetime of wounds, and she felt a desperate, loving need to shield him from this final callous blow. Her fear of the outside world was immense, a towering giant in her mind. But her love for this old man and this sacred piece of earth was, she discovered, even bigger. To fight an enemy, one must first know its name. Ezekiel, spurred by the fire in Margaret's spirit, agreed they needed to learn more. He disappeared for a day, melting into the landscape to seek out the scattered remnants of mountain folk, families living in the hidden folds of the mountains, forever moving to stay ahead of the encroaching lines on the surveyor's maps. He returned at dusk, his face grim. The news was not of soldiers or violent land grabbers, but of something far more insidious. The land had been purchased by a new settlement company, one that was attracting homesteaders with promises of a progressive, peaceful community. It was to be called Cedar Valley, a place built on the principles of respect and fairness. And the family leading this venture, the name whispered with a confusing mixture of resentment and hope, was Whitmore. They were Methodists, it was said, good people who treated the frontier folk they employed with unusual kindness. The very people who held the deed to this land, the ones who would be responsible for their eviction, were by all accounts decent and honorable. This revelation was a disorienting blow. It was a far more complex and terrible threat than two drunken speculators. How do you fight an enemy who is not evil? How do you stand against progress when it wears the mask of benevolence? Margaret was plunged into a moral wilderness. It was a conflict not between right and wrong, but between two different rights. The right of a man to live on the land he had inhabited for decades, and the right of a family to build a better world for their own people. She spent the entire night staring into the embers of the fire, the terrible paradox turning over and over in her mind. She looked at Ezekiel, asleep under his furs, and saw the decades of quiet dignity and unspoken loss in his peaceful face. She knew then that he could not win this fight. His voice was silent to the world of deeds and laws. He was a relic, a ghost they would politely and respectfully sweep aside. But she was not. She was a young woman with education. Her voice, however small and trembling, was one they might be compelled to hear. The thought of returning to that world, of walking into a settlement filled with the same kind of men who had populated her nightmares, was a terror that threatened to swallow her whole. But as the first pale light of dawn touched the hollow rim, her decision had been made. The greatest act of courage is not to face a monster you know you can defeat, but to walk willingly into the darkness, armed with nothing but a sliver of hope. To save her home, she had to leave it. To protect Ezekiel, she had to face the world that had tried to destroy her. It was the ultimate sacrifice. She had to give up the peace she had just found to fight for the right to keep it. The next morning she stood before Ezekiel, not as a frightened girl, but as a reluctant warrior. She had bundled a few provisions in the faded blanket that had once belonged to her mother. Her face was pale, but her eyes held a steady, determined light. She explained her plan in a low, firm voice. She would go to the nearby settlement of Greenville. She would learn where to find this Whitmore family, and she would stand before them, not as a beggar, but as a witness. She would tell them the story of the man and the land their good intentions were about to destroy. Then, without a tear, she turned and walked towards the mouth of the hollow, her small figure outlined against the vast, unforgiving expanse of the world she now had to face alone. The journey to Greenville was a descent into a world she had forgotten. The pure, silent air of the high country gave way to the thick, smoke-dusted atmosphere of a settlement built on ambition and relentless growth. After the subtle living language of the hollow, the settlement was a chaotic roar of shouting merchants, clanging tools, and the rumble of wagon wheels. Every face that passed was a stranger's, their eyes holding a hardness and suspicion that made her skin crawl. For the first few hours, she was the ghost of the cabin all over again, making herself small, avoiding eye contact, her hard-won confidence threatening to crumble under the weight of so many careless, judging eyes. But then she would feel the faint outline of the carved bluebird through the cloth of her bundle, a solid, tangible reminder of her purpose. She was not fleeing this world anymore, she was confronting it. She was here as an ambassador for a kingdom of silence and stone, a kingdom whose only map was held in the heart of an old man. Finding the Whitmore land office was easy. It was the newest, proudest building on the main street. Its polished glass windows and freshly painted sign, a bold declaration of the future it intended to build. Standing before it, Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. This was the fortress of the man who held her world on a piece of paper. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The office was quiet and orderly, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. A man sitting at a large oak desk looked up. He was older, with a neatly trimmed grey beard and a face that, to her surprise, was gentle and thoughtful. There was none of the predatory sharpness she associated with powerful men. This was Samuel Whitmore, and his calm, quiet demeanor was more disarming than any show of aggression would have been. He invited her to sit, his voice even and kind, and asked what business a young woman like herself could have with his company. For a moment the old fear seized her, threatening to steal her voice. But then she looked into his eyes and saw not a tyrant, but a man of conviction. She realized then that a legal argument would be useless. She had no deed, no title, no right that he would recognize. The only thing she had was the truth, and so she did not argue. She told a story. Her voice, at first a hesitant whisper, grew stronger and clearer as she spoke. She described a hidden hollow, not as attractive land, but as a living place, a sanctuary where the rhythm of life was still tied to the sun and the seasons. She described an old man, not as a trespasser, but as its rightful guardian, a man whose knowledge was written not in books, but in the flight of the hawk and the turning of the leaves. She spoke of his silent kindness, of the life he had saved, of the profound peace that existed in that small corner of the world. She made him see Ezekiel not as a problem to be solved, but as a man whose existence was a sacred text her listener was about to burn without ever having read it. When her story was finished, a deep silence filled the office. Samuel Whitmore looked at her, his expression unreadable but his attention absolute. Margaret knew that her words had moved him, but that they were not enough. Words were air. He dealt in property in lines on a map. So she reached into her bundle, her hand closing around the worn, smooth wood of the bluebird. With a quiet reverence, she placed it on the polished surface of his desk. The small, faded toy looked impossibly fragile and profoundly ancient in that modern office. "He carved this," she said softly, "more than 17 years ago. It was a gift for the infant daughter of a woman who was a friend to his wife." She paused, letting the weight of the statement settle. "That woman was my mother. I was that child." The small bird sat between them, no longer just a toy, but a bridge across time, a testament to a forgotten history of peace and friendship. It was an undeniable physical proof that the lines between their worlds were not as sharp as the ones on his map. Samuel Whitmore stared at the bluebird, then at Margaret, and the conviction in his own eyes began to waver, replaced by a look of deep, troubled contemplation. He was a Methodist, a man who had built his life and his fortune on a foundation of principle. He had come to Tennessee to build a community of harmony, and this young woman and her small, powerful totem had just shown him that his first act would be one of profound disharmony. He saw the hollow now not as Parcel 89, but as the home of a man whose wife had shown kindness to one of his own people. After a silence that stretched for an eternity, he slowly rolled up the large map that lay on his desk. "The boundaries of Cedar Valley," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "will not be drawn through a good man's home. The hollow will be left in peace." Margaret felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. She had won, but just as she prepared to give her thanks and leave, Whitmore stopped her. He looked at her with a new intensity, a look of profound respect and dawning realization. "You speak the language of two worlds," he said. "I came here to build a bridge between them, but I see now that I do not know how." "You do." He then made her an offer that shook her to her core. He asked her to stay. He offered her a home, a respected position and a purpose to work as a healer and a mediator for the new settlement, to ensure that the story of Ezekiel would be the last of its kind. The offer hung in the air, a crossroads presented by fate. She had just won back her silence and solitude, and now she was being asked to step into the very center of the storm, not as a victim, but as a leader. Margaret looked at the kind, hopeful face of Samuel Whitmore, and then in her mind's eye she saw the weary, resigned face of Ezekiel. She saw the chasm between their two worlds, a canyon of mistrust and misunderstanding, carved by generations of conflict. To return to the safety of her hollow would be to turn her back on the man who had taught her what true strength was. It would be to preserve her own peace at the expense of a greater one. In that moment, she understood the final lesson Ezekiel had been teaching her all along, that survival is for the self, but a life of purpose is for others. All aside, her own pain had shown her the wounds of the world, and his kindness had shown her how they might be healed. With a quiet nod, she accepted. She would be the bridge. Years passed. The raw, unsettled land of the Tennessee mountains slowly yielded to the community of Cedar Valley. It was not the perfect utopia Samuel Whitmore had dreamed of, for no place built by human hands ever is, but it was different. It was a place where the fences were a little lower, where the mountain families who had lived there for generations were treated not as ghosts but as neighbors. It was a place of fragile, difficult but genuine peace, and at the heart of that peace was Margaret. She never held an official title. She was known simply as the healer or the bridge woman. Her home was a small cabin on the edge of the settlement, a place that was itself a bridge between the tidy grid of the town and the untamed wilderness that surrounded it. Her garden was a tapestry of two worlds, with orderly rows of settlers' vegetables growing alongside wild, potent herbs Ezekiel had taught her to identify. People of all kinds found their way to her door. A mother whose child was consumed by fever, a farmer locked in a bitter water dispute with a mountain family, a young man struggling to find his place in a changing world. To each she offered not just remedies, but a deep, non-judgmental listening that seemed to soothe the very soul. The whispers that followed her now were not of pity for the beaten daughter of Josiah Hayes, but of a quiet, reverent awe for the woman who seemed to understand the heart of the land and the hearts of its people in equal measure. On a warm evening in late summer, Margaret made the familiar journey back to her hollow. The path was a welcome friend, each turn and stone a part of her own story. The hollow was just as she had left it, a timeless sanctuary, an anchor of silence in her often tumultuous life. Ezekiel was much older now, his body frail, but his spirit was as clear and bright as ever. They sat by the fire, the comfortable silence between them, a language richer than any words. He watched her, a deep pride shining in his pale eyes. He saw the woman. She had become calm, confident, her scars no longer wounds, but the beautiful, intricate lines on a map of a life well lived. He told her he had one last gift for her. From an old leather satchel, he retrieved a small, intricately beaded medicine bundle. It was ancient, and it radiated a quiet power. He explained that it had belonged to his wife, Sarah Grace. She was a bridge woman too, he said softly. She believed that one day a healer would come to this valley, a child born of two worlds, one of great pain from settlers and one of great kindness from mountain folk. She said this child would have the strength to weave the torn pieces of our worlds back together. He then revealed the final astonishing truth. Margaret's mother had been more than just a friend to his wife. She had been her devoted student, learning the mountain way of healing, of listening to the plants and understanding the balance of the spirit. His wife had been preparing this very medicine bundle for her, believing she might be the one to fulfill the vision. But when Josiah Hayes had dragged his wife away into isolation and cruelty, the circle was broken. "My wife's spirit waited," Ezekiel said, placing the bundle in Margaret's hands. "And when I found you broken at the edge of the rocks, I knew it had not been wrong. It had only been patient." Margaret looked down at the bundle, the threads of her life finally weaving together into a single breathtaking tapestry. Her pain, Her flight, her rescue, her purpose. It was not a series of accidents. It was a destiny, a legacy of healing passed down from a friendship between two women, a vision she was now fulfilling. Her entire life, even the darkest parts, had been the forging of the perfect instrument for this sacred work. She was not just a survivor, she was the answer to a prayer. The narrator would say that Margaret Hayes's name was never carved onto a grand monument, but her legacy was written in the quiet endurance of a community. She never married, finding her great love not in a single person, but in the family she built from the desperate souls of Cedar Valley. Her redemption was not a gift she was given, but a treasure she forged from the ashes of her own suffering. Her destiny, set in motion by the compassion of a widowed mountain man, was not to be tied to a new life, but to be fundamentally and purposefully free. But true freedom, she had learned, is not the absence of bonds, but the strength to choose the bonds that heal the world. Did you enjoy this journey? Tell us what part of the world you're watching this story from. Leave a comment, and to not miss the next adventures, subscribe to the channel.